Hello and welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And I'm really happy to welcome onto the show this week, Whitney Bauman. Whitney, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So you're teaching at Florida International University and in the Religious Studies Department, and you're really one of the leading figures in the field of religion and ecology. I mean, this last decade, you've published a crazy amount of books. I think it's fair to say that that's actually crazy. So I'll just list some of them. We don't have time to go over all of them. But Theology, Creation, and Environmental Ethics, from Creatio Ex Nihilo to Terra Nullius, right, based on your dissertation. And so that's a really great work by itself. But then shortly thereafter, you have another monograph, Religion and Ecology, Developing a Planetary Ethic. And then last year, I think it was with Kevin O'Brien, you have Environmental Ethics and Uncertainty, Wrestling with Wicked Problems. And then along with that, so many different anthologies, including some that happen to be conveniently placed behind me right now, including Grounding Religion. That's a really great book, very eminently teachable. Also, you've edited the Bloomsbury Handbook of Religion and Nature with Laura Hobgood. And then this nice little piece here, Meaningful Flesh, Reflections on Religion and Nature for a Queer Planet, which I want to emphasize is also open access. So it's fun just to download something and hope that maybe one day you'll read it, but also great to give free stuff to students. So thanks for being on here. I want to ask you a few questions to get your perspective on like what religion and ecology means to you, where you think the field is going. First and foremost, why do you study religion and ecology? Why do you work in this field? How did you get involved with it?
Thank you. That's a great question. And also thanks for the introduction. I still have the imposter syndrome, so that never goes away. So I don't, I feel like these were all done because of all the people that are around me and not because of me. So anyways, but thank you. So yeah, how did I get into this? Well, there's sort of like, I have personal autobiographical reasons, and then some mentorship sort of types of things. So autobiographically, it was, I mean, everything's autobiographical, I guess, but anyway, but in terms of like my background, I grew up in Arkansas, and my paternal grandparents had a family farm that I grew up, we had a farm, I grew up around, and we had a plot there where we grew our own vegetables and all of this stuff. And we had reservoirs where we go fishing, and we would go hunting in the different seasons for deer and duck and geese and squirrel and rabbit and these sorts of things. We had fruit trees there. There were, even chickens at different times. So I grew up in that sort of setting, around sort of being very connected to how my food, where it came from, and this sort of thing. And I didn't think that was special until much later, when I started, when I went to public schools and all this sort of thing, and most people didn't sort of have that same education growing up, to know where their food came from, right? The sort of ecological deficit disorder that people are talking about now was very real when I would try to talk to people about, where vegetables and these other things came from. So, and then sort of another part of that was that during the 80s and sort of deregulation during the Reagan years, all these small family farms started to go under, and that was those pressures also hit my family farm. And so, my grandfather at the time made the decision to do more and more sort of monocropped soybeans, right, Monsanto style soybeans and rice. And so I watched slowly but surely over the years the sort of family farm with multiple different uses turn into this sort of monocropped, you know, area that, you wouldn't want to go fishing there,
Right.
and you wouldn't want to go hunting there after all of the things that had happened to it. And then eventually, of course, they sold it. I mean, after they died, that we ended up selling the farm. But anyways, this sort of narrative of, the transition of the family farm into this sort of monocropped industrial grossness was sort of part of my taproot into this field, because for me, sort of being connected and being there in that space was a very sort of spiritual and awe-inspiring and development, sort of like a place where I had a lot of growth spiritually and mentally and this sort of thing. And so I had this big attachment to it. And then, I ended up going to college, and here's where the mentor stuff comes in. I didn't know that religious studies was a field that you could study even when I went to college. So I decided to take something because one of my professors said you should take a class in religious study. So I took a class with Jay McDaniel called Religion, Animals, and the Earth. And sort of then I was like, oh, wow, my environmental sensibilities and my religious sensibilities can come together into a single thing. And so I started taking more classes with him. And then he suggested that I go to Vanderbilt Divinity School and study with Sally McFaig, who did eco-theology stuff. And so I got to study with her then. And then I ended up going to Berkeley at a time when Rosemary Radford Ruther was teaching there after she left Garrett Evangelical, and Carolyn Merchant was over at Cal. And then my third member, Marian Grau, who brought all the post-colonial and critical theory to me, it all just sort of came together into the dissertation that you mentioned earlier. All of that wouldn't have, I wouldn't have been encouraged through all of that if I had not met the great people in the Forum on Religion and Ecology and the Religion Ecology group at the AAR. So I remember still after my first paper at the AAR, Laurel Kearns and Heather Eaton and Mary Evelyn and John coming up to me and telling me what a great job it was and encouraging me. And I wasn't even in grad school then, right? So I was like, it was between when I did my master's and PhD, and I was doing this horrible paper, and I look back on it, like, it was horrible. But they still encouraged me, right? And so there was that sense of encouragement, right? That I wasn't just, that I knew something, that I had a point, right? And they encouraged me to continue along this path, right? So all of those things I think led to me me entering this field.
Right. That's really an amazing group of teachers too. I mean, some people are lucky to have like one of those connections or something, and just have great teacher after great teachers is pretty special. And yeah, I've found that too. I mean, part of the reason that I felt so welcome in the field of religion ecology is because I met you very early on. And so then you kind of introduced me to some of these people. Like, it's strange that there's a group in academia where people are friendly and appreciate each other. And like, nah, that sounds like some kind of strange, like rumor maybe. And you go there and you're like, no, there's actually genuinely nice people. Like, ah, it's gotta be some
Yeah,
ulterior motives or something. Like, no, it seems like the motive is that like we're one species on one planet, well, let's try to get along and support each other a little bit, and so changes the frame of reference maybe.
yeah, exactly. I mean, to me, it makes perfect sense that the people that care about the integrity of planetary ecosystems would also care about the integrity of social ecosystems and
Yep.
this sort of thing, and want to foster that growth. So to me, it's like I really love that model of behavior. If you're you can't just care for the planet and then not care about human relations, because we are a part of the planet. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, a competitive game. No, I'm the one who cares about the planet, no
yeah,
room for the rest of you. And that doesn't
right,
really
right.
add up too well. And that's one of the things I appreciate about a lot of the stuff that you've done is that your writing, also teaching, engages things not just at the kind of local ecosystem level, but is thinking larger about the whole planet, right? Thinking about like a planetary ethic, not
Mhm.
just local environmental issues or regional issues, but really how to come together and think at these kind of large scales. So along those lines, you get into some really tough problems, right? Climate change, mass extinction, problems are technically not solvable problems, right? Wicked problems, right? There's better or worse responses, but no real solutions. So I wonder if you could say something about what it's like to have no idea what's going on, right? A lot of what you focused on lately has been like unknowing, right? A kind
Yeah.
of viable agnosticism, uncertainty, right? How does that stuff figure into your work?
Yeah. So it is sort of a difficult path to walk on, because both on the political side, it's kind of is it irresponsible for me to talk about uncertainty and ambiguity when there's fake news and alternative facts, and the truth is being twisted, every which way but loose. And then on the side, in terms of being in the field of religion and science, that's another field that I'm in, and religion and ecology, there's that science side that's like, no, there are these facts, there are these, and so I guess one of the ways that I like to think about it is that is sort of what I've been trying to articulate most recently in terms of like a critical planetary romanticism, right? And so the way I look at it is that and I'll start with the reverse. I'll go in reverse. So romanticism, right? This is the sort of new materialism, the idea that there's vitality throughout the rest of the natural world, right? That we are not the only things that have inherent value and worth and agency, but that there are actants all throughout the planetary community that we're a part of, and we're entangled with these. And the planetary, so that romanticism does not become localized, and co-opted by a nationalism, which happened with a lot of 19th century romantics, whether that's, whether that becomes, national parks and national pride that way, or the romanticism of blood and soil in Germany, right? That there's a certain sensibility of romanticism that can become local and parochial, and sort of keep out the foreign things, and let's preserve the original, right, state of nature or something like this. And so that I want the planetary part, so that we realize that the context for thinking in a romantic way has to be this planetary scale, and how all these locals fit together within that, that it can't just end at my local, my bioregion, or what have you. And then the critical part, because to remind us that every single body experiences the worlds that we inhabit differently and are treated differently. So we need critical race theory, we need queer theory, we need sex, feminist theory, we need disability theory. We need all these sorts of theories to help remind us that there is no sort of direct connection to nature, but that connection and knowledge of nature is always mediated through our bodies, right? And so for me, that means then that there has to be, the more perspectives, the better. So multi-perspectivalism is part of getting a better understanding of the planetary community, but it also means that we have to admit a certain amount of agnosticism and unknowing, because we don't have this one-to-one connection. And for me, the way that I look at sort of the loosey-goosey play with facts on both the left and the right is that, when dealing with wicked problems and these complex problems that have no single answers, and for which every answer there's a whole new set of problems, it's easy. Conspiracy theories are easy, right? Because it may be a wild tale, but it's still they explain things, right? Religion at its worst does this, right? Give me the easy answers, right? And don't look at the complex things. So, the denial of all these different perspectives, not just human ones, is the way in which somebody can say that science isn't real, right? Or climate change isn't real. You're denying all the different voices of the planetary community that tell you otherwise, right? So it's literally ignoring the multiplicity to sort of impose your own view upon the rest of the natural world, right? So that to me is it's not about it's not postmodernism's fault that that we have this sort of alternative facts and fake news stuff going on, but rather it is to me that's the final outcome of a colonial sort of objectivity that seeks to impose its logic onto the rest of the face of the planet willy-nilly.
Right. Yeah, I like that a lot. It's like the problem with people, messing with facts in a way that suits their agenda is precisely that they're trying to take out the interpretive dimension. They're taking out the different perspectives. They're making it seem like this is just the ironclad truth. This is the absolute only way it could possibly be. Everything else is just a lie. I'm like, well, that's how you know that it's a lie, is when they say that there's no way that this is in any way false, right? This is absolute. This is totally solid ground, no unknowing whatsoever. Like, that's the red flag. And then when somebody's like, I don't know, we're like 99% sure. You're like, now that's a good fact, right?
Yeah.
It admits that there's some uncertainty, that there's more negotiations that can take place. And
right. And that's, I jokingly talked about this imposter syndrome, right? But I really do. I think that's a healthy part of being a person, a scholar, an academic, or just a knowing person, is to admit that, we're talking about probabilities. We're talking about the visible universe that we can measure, which is a very small portion of the universe. And right, so we're talking about, the tip of an iceberg when we're making these assumptions. There are common grounds we can get to: gravity. We're animals, we're mammals. These
Right.
we breathe air, we eat. There are these common things, but these are we can agree upon on a certain structure and this sort of thing, but
Hmm.
not forever in all times and all places, right?
Yeah.
Throughout the long expanse of the universe, right?
Yeah.
So that's I just think we have to admit a little bit the edges of our awareness and our knowing, and be honest about that.
Yeah, right. The real imposters are the people who don't think they're imposters. Like, no, I
Right.
totally belong here. Definitely absolute certainty. Like, no, okay, something's up with that.
Right. Right.
Yeah, every
Exactly.
time there's one of those tests, on online that's like, prove you're not a robot. I'm like, uh-oh. Sometimes those are really hard.
Yeah.
They're like, identify
Exactly.
all the things with bicycles in them. I'm like, is that a bike? Am I a
Right.
robot? Ooh, I don't know.
Exactly.
And, I
And
gotta
again,
add that with
question.
critical planetary romanticism, uh, that's CPR, right? That you're giving CPR for the planet. Just have to
Yeah.
emphasize that, because when the first time I read something where you're talking about that, I was like, critical planet. Oh, CPR. It's always
CPR.
with the
Yeah.
jokes. And I appreciate that, because that's part of that kind of keeping things open, right? Is using a little bit of humor. That's
Yeah.
part of the critical in CPR, right? Is they keep it
Right.
open, and that means keeping it a little laughable.
And also, like, the more I think about it, the more I sit with it a little bit, right? What's the point of CPR? Um, it's not so that we then become managers of the planet. No, you want the Earth to become its own, that its own, to maintain its own flourishing and viability that we're then a part of, and it's its own thing, right? So it's not under our control. We can do our part in trying to help planetary flourishing, but we can't manage
Yeah,
the whole planet, that sort of
yeah,
thing.
yeah. It's a nice image. Um, well, speaking of that kind of thinking, you had a piece recently about sourdough time.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that was another thing where I'm like, what's this going to be about? And then reading it, I'm like, this is very thoughtful, but also funny. So I always appreciate that tone. And especially when you're talking about something as serious as the way that we're all responding to our global pandemic. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about what sourdough time is about, and how sourdough baking relates to justice making.
Yeah, sure, sure. And also, like, I'm very, I tread lightly on that, because I don't want anybody to say that, sourdough baking and marching for Black Lives Matter is equivalent. That's not what I'm saying at all. So, but what I am saying is that, we live and we spend most of our time in this sort of chronological fossil fueled world, flying around. Well, for us, at least in the academic world, and for business people, not for everybody, I realize that, but for modern sort of Western peoples that have a certain amount of privileges, it's about moving around the world, flying around the world, going to meetings. Even if you're not flying around, you're commuting to work by train or by rail, and it's sort of this sped up sense of time, right? We can, even through our computers, sit at home and get all the news of the world on our laptops, right? And sort of everything has to fit into this sort of sped up sort of understanding of what can be done in one day, right? And that I think, since the fossil fueled sort of accelerations, that the great acceleration that some sociologists talk about since World War II, with the increase of speed and transportation, communication, and production technologies, that this fast sort of fossil fueled pace about what can be done in a single day or a given year has just finally come to a point where it's outstripping the carrying capacity of the planet and the carrying capacity of what it means to be human, right? All of the anxieties and depressions and all these illnesses that come about through the stresses of modern Western life, so to speak. And not to mention what's happening as a result of this extractive, this fossil fueled extraction to other places around the world, and the impoverishment of other peoples and other ecosystems. So that is sort of like the sort of that's the return to normal that we want to go to, right? This great economic inequity, sexism, racism, so on and so forth, ecological degradation. So I think during this pandemic time, even for those people who are essential workers and have, we're jolted out of this daily life, and focus on something else. And so, for me, it's just been thinking about different times and sort of, my husband and I have started bird watching out of off our balcony, for instance. I mean, and because of the reduced noise pollution, I can hear geese flying over and migrating, this fall, which I have never heard before in Berlin until this year,
Wow.
right? And so, I think we're reading to, Lisa Sedaris is writing about biophony and sort of the sounds that we're being reintroduced to because of the pandemic slowdown, because there's a lot less noise pollution, right? So we're reattuning to the worlds and recognizing, I think, that what we lose in this sort of sped up fossil fuel chronological time, right? So the times of the planet mean that there have to be the life cycle of the hawk, or the times of evolution, or the times of a river, or the times of a forest, or the times of a single insect, right? Or for me, the time of sourdough bread. It's totally inefficient. Um, you can't predict one loaf to another, right? It depends on all these other factors. And so you just have to let it take its own time, right?
Yeah.
It forces you out of, I've got to get this done in 8 hours, and it forces you out of this chronos, right? Like sort of many religious traditions have done, through contemplation or through ingesting substances that put us into a different time, or through dream time, if you will, or through thinking about the long arc of justice that Martin Luther King Jr. speaks of, and sort of the time of protest and the time of recognition that things are not right, and now we have time to reflect on it and do something about it, right? So it's very inefficient to have these movements for for racial justice, for sex justice, for justice in terms of sexuality issues. And it's very inefficient, right? Because it gunks up the daily life of things, and you have to step out of your normal economic chronological flow and say, no, we're going to the streets. This is going to be a different time, And so I don't think it's a coincidence that the Black Lives Matter movement has really taken off during the time of the pandemic, because people are able to notice more, and we've slowed down to a certain extent, or at least gotten taken out of this habitual fossil fuel chronological time enough to see what's going on.
Right. Being inefficient with a system where efficiency is destroying the planet. It's like, well,
Right.
then the best answer right now is to become radically inefficient. So
Exactly.
yeah, sourdough in that sense and protests both do that. Like, oh, this is not an efficient way to handle things. And you
And
hear that with
also,
some critiques of protests. They're like, this isn't the way to do it. Now's not time to protest. And they're like, well, that's exactly why it's the right time to protest.
right. And like we were talking about a little bit earlier, in terms of, what, teach poorly online, because I don't want this to become the new norm. I don't, don't become this efficient online teacher, because that will then help usher in the new norm, right?
Yeah,
But hold the
exactly.
space open for in-person interactions,
Yeah. I like that. Anything that says you don't have to be that good, I'm like, I'll sign up for that. Like maybe
Yeah,
kind of messing up might actually be the most creative way to engage these things, but it also
right,
takes some pressure off of you too. So it's
right,
just a more relaxed way to approach things. That reminds me of the Taoist concept of non-doing, right? Wei wu wei, doing non-doing. Like what's the best thing you can do? Maybe not doing stuff, doing something very
exactly.
inefficiently.
Exactly, and that's something I think that we lack in general in our sort of monotheistic influence cultures, right? Is
Yep.
that it's all about what do we do, and it's like sometimes it's about not doing,
Yep.
or pulling back, And this is why I like the idea that Halberstam, Jack Halberstam brought up, which is the queer art of failure, right?
Yep.
Is that in a system that is leading to racial, sexual injustice, in a system that's leading to all this ecological. The best thing we can do is to fail that system and begin to think about, how can we gunk up the system and create new spaces, carve out new spaces, right, that we can hold on to, so that we don't return to that normal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that always made me so nervous in the first couple months of the pandemic. You're like, oh, well, hopefully we can go back to normal. And once we get back to normal, I'm like, no, normal was killing us.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah, The Queer Art of Failure. Yeah, I love that book. That's so good. And anything that's really emphasizing, right, that the whole system of success is the problem. So real
Right,
success is going to look a lot more like failure.
right.
And you mentioned you're in Berlin, and so I wanted to ask you a little bit about Ernst Haeckel. That's another part of your work that you've been engaging a lot for recent years, and obviously you're in a great place to do that. So I'm not sure if a lot of people really know that much about him beyond the fact that like he coined the term ecology back in the 19th century, and then beyond that, people, I don't know, maybe he's too romantic, or isn't he a little racist about, all these kinds of things, and then people just kind of move on. But you've really dove in pretty deeply.
Yeah, so I spent a couple years in his archives, and I'm still working on this manuscript, which keeps changing, of course. But I'm trying to incorporate uh, Haeckel's non-reductive materialism into this work that I'm doing on um, critical planetary romanticism. So what I'm interested in terms of Haeckel is that, especially Haeckel and Wilhelm Bolsche and a couple of other people like them, these romantic 19th century scientists that really did have a non-reductive understanding of the material world all the way up to the 20th century. And because at that time, there wasn't an agreed upon naturalistic worldview, right? So when Darwin's theory of evolution came out, people started to sort of try to put all the sciences together into such a naturalistic worldview. And Haeckel was one of the first ones to really do this, but he did so in a non-reductive way that he called a monistic way. And so for him, everything is made up of matter, energy, and a feeling. It's been translated as feeling, but psychome. So feeling or something like this. So basically, and you can't reduce anything down to that tripartite structure. So he has this triune monism, and he really understands everything from crystalline structures to human brains as containing, all these sorts of things. And so I found that really interesting. And for him, sort of the end goal of science was about wonder and awe. So he has this sort of really aesthetic component to science. So it's not about how can science produce things for the human world, but it's about sort of getting to know the world around us and finding our place therein. And so he sort of realized very early on that placing humans in an evolutionary perspective meant that there were no stable forms, and so there was no stable male or female. And so he also supported the work of Magnus Hirschfeld, who started the Institute for Sexuality Studies in the 19th century in Berlin. That was only shut down by the Nazis, but and that was a center for trans people. They had drag shows. It was a sort of a research / community center for all sorts of identities on the LGBTQ spectrum. And Haeckel was of course, like there's all this diversity in nature and all the other animals, so why wouldn't there be in humans, right?
Right.
So placing humans for Haeckel into the evolutionary perspective also meant that we couldn't have this objective view, that there had to be interpretation, and that because we're a part of the process, not above it, and for him, it also meant redefining sort of goodness, beauty, and truth from immanent perspectives. These weren't ideals that were imposed upon the world, but they had to emerge out of the world, right? And so for all these reasons, I'm sort of putting him into dialogue with new materialisms and sort of new romantic movements, I guess that you would say, that we see today. And just as a way of saying, these don't come from nowhere, these don't come ex nihilo, but they have also some important roots. And at the same time, cautioning this sort of naive, or not naive, but the type of uncritical romanticism that Haeckel had about his own social location. So for him, the evolutionary sort of tree led right up to Germans at the top, and European monotheistic cultures at the top, and Jews and Black peoples were despaired in his writing. So he had an ethnocentrism and a nationalism and a racism that I want to sort of say that's why we need this critical part, right? We need these critical theories to talk about embodiment so that we don't mistake our own view of nature for the view of nature.
Yeah, which is easy to do. It seems like anytime somebody's like, "Here's my evolutionary framework," and you're like, "And who's at the top?" And they're like, "Me. I made it to the top." Like, what a coincidence!
Yeah,
How funny that that worked out that way. Yeah, and I appreciate that you're finding resources in Haeckel's thought, right, to subvert the worst tendencies of it. You know, because
right,
otherwise
right,
it's easy to see some mistakes in him and be like, "Oh, we should just not read him." Like, actually, his own thought has ways for us to overcome those kinds of biases and prejudices.
right. And it's precisely why we should read these 19th century thinkers, who, were some of the first that were trying to put knowledge into an evolutionary perspective, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it's just that, from that position, they couldn't get out of sort of the hierarchical evolution and progression sort of mentality. Um, in a way that I think we can today. Now, of course, not we don't always, but we can.
Right. There's more people working toward that at least. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
there's more resources, more scholarly support for it. And yeah, still a little bit of a way to go. But
Yeah,
but yeah, making progress, I guess, in that
yeah,
sense. Progress to maybe rethink the very idea of progress, right?
yeah. And progress without ultimate ends, I would say.
Right, right. Where there might be a lot of people at different kinds of tops at the same point, right? Instead of just
Right,
there's one hierarchy, one pinnacle, and it happens
right,
to be me and my best friends.
right, exactly.
Right.
It's that
Yeah.
whole like, sort of decolonial plurivocality sort of thing where
Right.
there's not just a single universe anymore, but there's this sort of multiverse of worlds that we can then link together, but they can't be subsumed under the other, that sort of thing.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It reminds me, your early work, you dealt a lot with Val Plumwood, and that was part of, her thinking is we have to get past hegemonic centrism. And like, well, what
Right.
happens then? Is there no center? Like, no, there's lots of centers. Now we kind of
Yeah.
live in this multi-centric world where everything can show up in its own kind of way. and
Right.
and the same with thinking about time, right? That sourdough has its own center, it has its own time, and
Yeah.
protests have their own time, and the long arc of history has its own time. So yeah, I think it's a dizzying world to kind of get into because you lose that sense of stable foundation, but also seems like one that's very playful and kind of an erotic joy to that, right? A kind of polymorphous perversity.
Yeah, there is, and it's also quite it's quite freeing, I think. Um, I can't remember which Latour book it is, but he talks about sort of the collapse into imminence, like, and sort of at first you might be afraid that there is not an out, but then you realize that you're the multiplicity and you're free and you're much more free to experience
Yep.
the world and all its multi perspectival embodiments, and this sort of thing. So
Yeah.
because there's not something out there towards which you're being judged and this sort of thing, rather, but we help co-construct the worlds, right? So not that it's not relative at all, but it's about taking responsibility for the worlds that we help to co-construct, and then looking and seeing, what bodies are being harmed by these constructions, and then working together to try to modify these
Yeah.
worlds so that more bodies are included, and doing it again and again and again and again ad infinitum. So
Yeah.
um,
Easy.
easy
Easy.
peasy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really that simple. Once you just kind of give yourself the time, you can start
Yeah.
experimenting with these other ways of being. Yeah. All right. Well, geez, I think I better let you go, or I'm just gonna talk forever. It's a problem. We're trying to keep these kind of short. There's some podcasts that just go on and on and on, and it's
Yeah.
hard for me not to do that, especially when I get to talk to some of my favorite people. So
Oh,
I'll
pleasure.
have to have you back on soon. Um, who knows when you will hear from me.
Okay.
But but yeah, I really appreciate you making the time, and I really appreciate all the work you've done, all the support that you give to folks like me, other members of the religion ecology community, and looking forward to seeing you virtually at the AAR in a few weeks.
Thank you, Sam. It's been great.
All right. Well, thanks to Whitney, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll be back next week with some more content for you, another member of the religion and ecology community. And in the meantime, stay well.